Got a new sheet to hand out this morning. It's on its way to the back table, and I know Dad's got a few copies. We'll get started after we get that handed out. Yeah, we're studying what we handed out last week today. This is for next week. Hey, Dad, if you'll give Tom some, he might be able to come down that side. So we started a new study on the Sermon on the Mount. We gave out some materials last week. That's what we're going to be studying today. And there's a few extra copies. I would say maybe 10 or so extra copies of the cover sheet and the syllabus, the outline for our study, and the text with notes and the discussion questions. There's two separate pages, but it looked to be about 10 or so pages on the back table. And what you're getting today, we're doing it just like on a Wednesday night. We get it, we take it home, we study it, we bring it back, and we discuss it. But today, we are taking a look at lesson number 1, which is an introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. We talked about a few things last week, but this is our formal introduction today. So this morning you're getting a sheet to take home, and depending on how you're looking at it, on one side you'll have the text, and then on the back side you'll have discussion questions. And if you'll notice, this is lesson number 2, and on our next lesson we'll be in Matthew 5 verses 3 through 12. We're talking about the Beatitudes next. So if you'll take that sheet home, there aren't as many questions, and that's because there are more individual points to the Beatitudes, but we have a lot to discuss under each of those. So if you'll look at those, what does it mean when Jesus says poor in spirit? Or what does it mean when he says, blessed are those that mourn, or the meek, or the hungry and thirsty after righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, peacemakers, those that are persecuted for righteousness' sake? What does it teach us? What do we learn? What are the blessings involved in that? And then we'll follow that up with some more generic, what do we take away from it? Why does he give those? And why is that at the beginning of each of the lists of the Sermon on the Mount? But today you should have lesson number 1, which is the introduction. And it does have a text along with it. It has Matthew 5, 1 and 2, and Matthew 7, verses 24 through 29. We're looking at those texts today. Our goal next week, I don't know if we'll do it, but our goal is to in one lesson go through the Beatitudes. I think if we watch our pace, I think we can do that. This morning we're doing what we would consider an introductory lesson to the Sermon on the Mount. And we have Matthew 5, 1 and 2, and Matthew 7, 24 through 29. So let's talk about those. Now, you have some discussion questions. Two of these are really the beginning of our study of the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm going to read them, and I'm just going to open it up, see what you found. And then we offered some scriptures maybe to help us move in the right direction, but we're going to explore these for our questions. So we had two questions. One was this: what would you say is the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount, and what is Jesus accomplishing through his teaching? Before we go to the second one, did you jot some thoughts down for that one? And what's he trying to do in the Sermon on the Mount, Terry? Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Have you noticed, I don't know if you've started reading it, maybe just, it wouldn't take you long or me long to read Matthew 5, 6, and 7, just to do that every day as we're studying. As you read it, have you noticed the number of times where Jesus will say, you have heard that it's been said, but I say to you. So there's a huge contrast between what was common understanding, which was really misunderstanding and then what Jesus came along to do. So that's certainly one thing. Anything else? Anybody get anything else? Joel? Sure. Absolutely. Yes. Sure. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. If you didn't hear Terry was talking about how he is contrasting the real intention of what God said versus what had become common belief, and they were way off base on that. And as Joel was saying, a lot of it is preparatory because he's getting ready for the church. He's preparing people for the church. Anybody get anything else on that? And then we'll, yes, Miss Kay. Yeah, I think so. Definitely tying the past to the present together. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, to fulfill it. And that and in that sense to correcting it, to putting it where its true intention was. Gene, you had your hand up, and then Philip. Sure. And I think that's something as we study, I think they had really missed that. And you hear a lot of people say something like that about the Old Testament, that in the Old Testament God was more concerned with outward action more than he was the heart. And that was never true because God has always been concerned with the heart. And I think the Sermon on the Mount sets that straight, that God's always concerned with how it starts here and moves outward. Philip, you had your hand up. Sure. Yes. Yeah. So let's try to put all that together. Everything that's been said. Yes, Art, go ahead. Definitely. But I say, yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the we're hopefully going to end on that question today, which is there was obviously something very different in not just the way he said it, but what he said, and they perceived something very different about Jesus. And I think that's going to help us as we start our study of the Sermon on the Mount. So let's try to everything that's been said is correct. Let's try to piece all of that together and see if we can put it all together. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 3. I'm going to mark my Bible in Matthew chapter 5, where the Sermon on the Mount is, but let's go back to Matthew chapter 3. Let's go back to John the Baptist. John the Baptist. A lot of people have referred to the Sermon on the Mount of something like a manifesto for Christian behavior. And I think something Joel said last week, I think, is we have to keep in mind is that the Sermon on the Mount is not the be-all and end-all of the Lord's teaching. It's a summary of the Lord's teaching, right? It's sort of... if you can get a condensed summary of what Christianity ought to look like, this is what it ought to look like. But he said a lot more things than just this. But the Sermon on the Mount is the Lord telling people, based on all the things you've said, this is what we ought to do, this is how we ought to think, this is how we ought to be perceived in the world. And a lot of that goes back to Matthew chapter 3. So here's John the Baptist. And if we start reading in verse 1, it says, "In those days John the Baptist came preaching in the wilderness of Judea." And listen to his message. He says, saying, "Repent." And what is he telling people? The kingdom of heaven, which is what? That's the church. He says, is at hand. What does that phrase "at hand" mean? How do we understand that? Yeah, coming soon. It's not going to be a long way away. But when he says it's at hand, it's however we would say it, we would say right around the corner, or it's approaching very quickly. He's telling people the church is almost here, and he's preparing people for that. He was preparing people for Jesus. Well, watch what happens in Matthew chapter 4. Here's Jesus. Jesus, he's been baptized. He's starting his ministry. He's calling his disciples. In Matthew chapter 4, drop down to verse 17. From that time, Jesus began to preach and to say, and what was his message? It's exactly the same. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So he's preparing people for the church. And so the Sermon on the Mount, remember last week we said, is really, when you think about the chronology of it, it's really the Lord's first real major address. It's the first real sermon he preached out in public. So the Sermon on the Mount is intended to prepare people for the church. Now, we talked about it a little bit last week. What was the state of the people? Not just economically, not just socio-politically, but what about spiritually? What kind of condition were the people in spiritually when the Lord comes on the scene in history? Yeah, they're dead, lost. I mean, they were in really a pitiful shape. I think we even read last week a passage from Matthew 9 where it talked about them being wearied and scattered and leaderless. They were just desperate. And so when he comes on the scene of history, these are people, they're searching. There's a lot of people who are really searching. They're looking for meaning and for peace and love and authenticity. They want something meaningful. They just weren't getting it. And where they were looking, well, it was all the wrong places. And so they're really looking for something. And now here comes Jesus saying the church is the place where you ought to be looking for this. But he's got to get people ready for that. And I think in some ways it's a lot like what we see today. I think we see a lot today where in that day where they should have looked for hope, they weren't finding it, right? Because the leaders were corrupted. All the people that should have given them insight into the Lord, they were corrupted. And maybe sometimes today it's that way where the church and culture have become indistinguishable, right? They're not separate like they're supposed to be. So let's go back. I wrote down in the notes 2 Old Testament scriptures, and I think these kind of set the background for us. They kind of pull together all the things you were saying just a moment ago. Let's go back to Psalm 106. Psalm 106. Here's a description of what had happened. Psalm 106. Psalm 106. We want to look at verse 34. If you want, there are a couple of verses that do this in the Old Testament. This is one of them. I think these are just almost single, they're like keys that unlock the Old Testament. If you want to understand Old Testament history, this explains why everything happened the way that it did. So verse 34, he just outright says, they did not destroy the peoples. What was the command? What were they charged to do? Destroy them. And to do it completely, right? Not to leave any trace of paganism in the land. This is a lot like, I think it's Numbers 33:55. He says, if you leave them, they're going to become pricks in your eyes, right? They're going to cause you to fall. And he said, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them, but they, and here's the word, they mingled with the Gentiles and learned their works. They served their idols, which became a snare to them. They even, verse 37, they even sacrificed their sons and daughters to demons and shed innocent blood, even the blood of their sons and daughters whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood. Thus they were defiled by their own works, verse 39, and played the harlot by their own deeds. And so they didn't do up front what God said, but over time what happened was that the people of God and the people of Canaan, the pagans, they were just indistinguishable from one another. They had become the same. You couldn't tell the difference between God's people and the world. I wrote down another one. It's Ezekiel chapter 20. Ezekiel chapter 20. And you probably, you probably jotted down some scriptures different than mine. I just put a few down that came to mind as I was going through this. Ezekiel chapter 20. But the language is very similar to Psalm 106. So Ezekiel chapter 20. And look at verse 32. I know it's a long chapter, but we're sort of splitting the difference here. Verse 32, he says, what you have in your mind shall never be when you say, we will be like the Gentiles, like the families in the other countries, or in other countries, serving wood and stone. But it goes to show their mentality. That as far as mindset and action, they were indistinguishable from the world. But from the very beginning of the Bible, what has God always called his people to be? Separate, different, right? Set apart. And they weren't anymore. And I think, based on everything you've said, I think you're exactly right. The Sermon on the Mount is Jesus going back and saying, you're supposed to be different, and the church is going to be different. You're not. You should be. But here's what you should be based on what God taught, and that's why you see that contrast. Now, to do that, I want to finish this question with two scriptures, because I think if we see this, we're going to say, the Sermon on the Mount is exactly that. Let's go back to Leviticus 18. This is a very important scripture for the Sermon on the Mount. Leviticus chapter 18. Leviticus chapter 18. Now, I didn't put a scripture in the notes, but do you remember that it appears often in the Old Testament? There's a statement God makes very frequently where He'll say, be holy, and then He gives them the reason for that. What did He say? Because I'm holy. You need to be holy, for I'm holy. So this plays off of that. Leviticus 18. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. So they would remember His holiness. According to the doings of the land of Egypt, where you dwelt, you will not do. Don't be like them, is what He's saying. And according to the doings of the land of Canaan, where I'm bringing you, you shall not do it. Nor shall you walk in the ordinances. You shall observe my statutes, keep my ordinances, to walk in them. I am the Lord your God. So He's saying, don't be like the people of the world. Be different. Let's see if that holds true in the Sermon on the Mount. Let's go to the Sermon on the Mount. Let's go to Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. Now, this is one of our discussions, is this pretentious religion, right? They were giving alms, but it was just all pretense. It's all pomp and circumstance. And they were praying, but all that was just feigned, right? It was just all a show. Well, in the middle of that discussion, drop down with me to verse 8. And the language may not be word for word, but the principle is here. Look at verse 8. Therefore, what does He tell His disciples? Do not be like them. Isn't that not the message of the Old Testament? When you go on the land of Canaan, what does He tell them? Don't be like them. And now He's saying in Matthew 6, verse 8, don't be like them. And in my judgment, I think this is probably one of the key verses of the entire Sermon on the Mount, because what it does, it connects, as someone said, it connects the past, like Art was saying, connects the past to the present. He's saying you should never have been like them. And look where you've come. Look where you're at now. And so He goes back and He corrects that. So every single block of teaching in the Sermon on the Mount is a contrast between what God wants out of people, the behavior that He wants, versus what we would call non-Christian behavior, including the hypocritical religious people that He condemns in this. Anything you want to add to those two questions before we move on? Okay, so here's the next question. This actually gets us now into the text. Let's look at Matthew 5. Matthew 5. Matthew chapter 5. So here's your next question in your notes. Let's look at verses 1 and 2. So we're going to, our goal is in the syllabus, we're going to cover every single verse in the Sermon on the Mount. And some of them we're stacking with other verses. We're going to do that today. So here's Matthew 5, 1 and 2. And seeing the multitudes, He went up on a mountain, and when He was seated, His disciples came to Him, and then He opens His mouth and He taught them. So let's look at these two verses. So the first question related to this is, who are these multitudes? Because it's very early in the Lord's ministry, right? If this is His first real discourse, then who are these multitudes? What did you find on that? Yeah, Art? Yes. Yeah, he's already generating a huge interest among the common people. And the religious leaders, they kept their distance and they're curious, but the people are already very interested in Jesus. In fact, go back up, and it may even be on the same page. If you look at Matthew 5:1, just go back a few verses into chapter 4. Start in verse 23. So here, Jesus is already doing this now. Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease among the people. Do you think that's generating interest among the people? Everywhere he goes, have you heard this he's healing people? Listen to his message. So verse 24, then his fame went throughout all Syria, and he brought to him all the sick who were afflicted in various diseases and torments, and those who were demon-possessed, and epileptics, and paralytics, and he healed them. And then it says, verse 25, and great multitudes followed him. So he has a huge crowd, and look where they're from. Galilee, Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, beyond Jordan. And if you look at these places, in just this short amount of time before the Sermon on the Mount is given on the Mount, he's already generated interest in nearly every part of Palestine. They're coming from everywhere to hear them. I think, if anything, it shows us just how desperate the people were for some kind of hope. They were being stifled by these religious leaders, and now this fresh message of righteousness and hope, it comes, and so I just think it's an amazing thing what he's doing here. But these are the multitudes. They're crowds from Galilee, Decapolis, Jerusalem, and Judea. Now here's the next question. Why do you think he chose the Mount? Why the Mount? It says he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Why did he pick a mountain to do that? He could have done it anywhere, right? Okay. There's an issue of visibility. There's an issue of audibility, right, where he needs to hear. And in many places, depending on where you are, if you're in a certain location, it almost presents itself as a natural amphitheater. There's some places where Paul preached, he did on purpose because they were natural amphitheaters. But he's in a place where his voice is going to carry and people are going to hear him. But I wonder, did you think any deeper about this? Is there perhaps a theological significance? Whether he says it or not, we just wonder whether this was part of it. Where did Moses go to receive the commandments? On a mountain. And now here's Jesus, in contrast to Moses, presenting himself as an even better than Moses, and here he is on a mountain giving his commandments, giving his ordinances and his principles. So it's hard to miss the theological parallel that of Moses on the Mount. Now, what about the sitting down? This was one of the questions. Yeah, go ahead, Joel. Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yes. Yeah, I think so. It was a cultural thing, right? So it's easy to dismiss that and say, well, he's probably been walking, he just sat down. But in those days, culturally, a teacher would sit when he offered instruction. So it was actually a position of authority to be able to offer instruction. So it was a cultural thing. Now, I jotted this down, but the more I thought about it, I think that as we study the life of Jesus, it's interesting, there are times when Jesus did not go along with things, like if the Pharisees were binding the washing of hands, he just rejected that. I mean, I'm not going to follow that. But there are times when culturally, he did things culturally that made no difference one way or another about the doctrine. He would do things culturally because they offer an advantage. And sitting down was the position, in that day, the position of a teacher. People would respect his assumption of that position. And I think that's right. I think the answer is that it's easy to dismiss that, but he did that on purpose because that's the position of a teacher culturally. So he was assuming a position of an instructor when he did that. Anybody else get anything different on that? But I think Joel's exactly right. I think it's a cultural thing, and Jesus was assuming a position of authority by the position he took on that. Okay, so let's spend the rest of our time now in Matthew 7. So those two verses aren't very difficult. I don't think there's anything difficult really about the Sermon on the Mount, other than it's just challenging, right? What he tells us is challenging. But now let's connect it with Matthew 7, verses 24 through 29. Matthew 7, verses 24 through 29. Okay, so here the first of these is a question on verses 24 through 27, and that is, what is the warning in verses 24 to 27? And depending on how you answered this, there was a follow-up question, which is, Do you see, in whatever way you answered that, do you see that as a common problem in the church, something we struggle with? So let's just read the verses. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. Now, everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. And so, obviously, the first thing is there is a tremendous word picture that Jesus presents here of the way to properly construct a house. Right? I'm sure Barry could probably tell stories about things people tried to get away with when building houses. You got to get the foundation right. But imagine somebody pulls a permit to build a house, and they think, well, before Barry gets here to check out the house, we're going to try to put the framing up and cover it up. And he gets there, and there's no foundation at all. They just put a bunch of sticks in the ground. They're already stick building the roof, and they've already got some decking on the roof. And Barry walks up and he touches, and the house is just like this. And he goes, what's going on here? And they say, well, but it's going to hold. And he's like, I could push this thing over right now. It's just real wobbly. Foundations matter, right? So Jesus is drawing together everything that he's been saying, all of the Sermon on the Mount, and he's bringing it to a close by saying it's foolish to try to just listen only without doing this. So when you read this, right? When you read this, what did you perceive is the real warning that Jesus is giving us here? What do you think? Yeah, what do you think, Joel? That's okay. Yes. Mm-hmm. Sure. It's going to collapse. Yeah, sure. No, that's great. I think that's a good application of that. Yeah, I think there's a warning, not just individually, but there's also a warning about, there's certainly a warning to the people about what the Pharisees were doing and about the kind of house that they had constructed for the people and the danger they were in by staying in it. So there's certainly some application of that. What else did you get, Tommy? And then Art? Yeah. Okay, yeah, so there's the analogy of the church, and it's hard to not see the connection when Jesus said, on this rock I'll build my church, right? So you got to have the right foundation. So anything that's not built on that foundation is going to collapse. And maybe they could tie that into what Joel's saying. There's a lot of religions that aren't built on the rock. There's only one that is. And as sincere as people may be, they're in a house that's collapsing. They may not know it, but it won't stand because it's not built on the rock. So that's certainly good application. Art? Yeah. Sure. Sure. And interestingly, it's not our goal to discuss it, but he just, in the same breath, he just took a breath and started this. The previous breath, he said, not everybody that says to me, Lord, Lord, is going to enter into the kingdom of heaven, but my Father, which, he does the will of my Father. He's just said not everybody's going to heaven. And, Matthew 7:21 to 23. And then he starts this about the good foundation. So there's certainly an application there. You have a lot of the Sermon on the Mount that's about don't be like the Pharisees who stand on the street corners and make long prayers and hope people think they're righteous. And don't be like those that drop their alms, an alms. Back in those days, it almost looked like an old record player where you had the big, the old original microphone that would come off the needle, and you had these coin coffers, and people would, they would go and they would change out all of their money into coins. So when they walked in the temple, they go, all that coin would hit that metal coming in, and people would go, man, look at all that money they're giving. When it wasn't much because they were just, and he said, don't do that. Do you think there's a warning here at the end of everything that Jesus is saying against just religion that is just pure intellectual knowledge only. It is nothing more than that. It's just pretentious knowledge, right? You can know something, but you're just not doing it. Do you think there's a warning in that? And do you think that's a problem in the church? That sometimes in the church, people may know the right thing, they just don't do it. And I think that's always been a problem in religion, where you have people who can know the right thing, and even says it down in verse 26. He says, "Everyone who hears these sayings of mine," well, they're hearing it, they understand it, but they're just not doing it. And I think there's always a danger in every generation of professing the right thing, of saying the right thing, of even acknowledging that this is the right thing. There's the danger of just not implementing it. And the Sermon on the Mount, I think it goes back to everything you guys were saying at the very beginning. The Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' way of saying, you can't just know it, you've got to do it too. It has to be part of daily life. You have to implement what's in the Sermon on the Mount. And all of his teaching, but you have to implement it. It does no good if Jesus says, if he says something like, don't be worried about tomorrow. There's enough worry in today to be worried about today. And you say, yep, that's what he taught, but I'm not personally doing that. It does no good, because it's just hearing and not doing. So I think there's a real danger in that, and I think sometimes in the church we suffer the same thing. Any thoughts on that? About just pretentious knowledge? Yeah, Gene? Yes. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Do you think, just by the way, just as an aside, would this be, if you're discussing with somebody, say you're discussing with somebody and they say, I believe that you could be saved by faith only, you don't have to do anything. Might this be a good verse to use to show someone that it's more than just mere faith that saves, that it takes more than that? Because it's one thing to hear, but Jesus said, if you hear and you don't do, well, that would be the same thing as saying if you believe but you don't do it, then you'd be like a person building your house on the sand. It would just be foolish to do that. So this is a powerful passage that teaches you there's more than just taking information in. It has to become part of life, right? So when Jesus is telling us these things in the Sermon on the Mount, it's more than just acknowledging that they're true. We have to actually do them. Otherwise, we are the foolish man at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Any thoughts on that before the next question? Yeah, Gene? Right. 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 Absolutely. So let's take a look at the last question now. Let's try to draw it all together with this question about authority. Verses 28 and 29. Let's read those two verses. And so it was, when Jesus had ended these sayings, that the people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. So the question is, in what way are we to understand Jesus taught with authority and not as the scribes? What did you get on that? What do you think about that? Scribes told people what they wanted to hear versus Jesus, who told people the truth. Yeah, there's a big difference in that. Any other thoughts? Mm-hmm. Yes. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Think so? Art? Yeah. Yes. Yes. Right. It's interesting the way that Jesus is said to have spoken. Jesus taught with authority, and the scribes taught by authority. There's a difference between the way those two people taught. When the scribes taught by authority, that's like Art was saying, it's like a delegated authority. But Jesus taught with authority, which is inherent, right? This is authority that's within him versus authority that someone else has given him. And the people, based on the way he was speaking, what he said, his manner, and the content, they understood that there's something very, very different about Jesus. They understood that. So there was something unique based on substance and quality and manner. For example, Jesus was a Jew, but he didn't teach like the Jews were teaching. It's very different than what the Jews were teaching. He did not interpret the law like the Jewish people were doing, because they were interpreting through the lens of Jewish tradition, the Pharisees and the scribes, but he wasn't doing that. He was just teaching the Word of God. And so there's a huge difference between the two. For example, when we speak of things about what we know, right? We speak about what we know. You come in, you talk about, whatever it is. There was a football game yesterday. You come in and talk about what you know. And we talk about God. But there was a difference. When Jesus talked, he just didn't know about God. What did he know? He knew God. He was God. In fact, look at Matthew chapter 5. We'll end on this. Matthew chapter 5. Listen to the wording. Verse 17. Do not think that, and maybe we skip over this because we're interested in the other parts of this verse. This is really important. Do not think that, and what are the next two words? I came. Now, when you're reading the Gospels and Jesus talks about I came, what's that a reference to? That's the language of his pre-existence, of his divinity. I'm God, but I came to this world to do something. And so all of the Sermon on the Mount is a demonstration of a different kind of authority than people had ever experienced before. They had heard people talk about the law. They had heard people say, well, this is what I think, like Art was saying, this is what I think the law says, but they had never heard somebody say, this is the law. And by doing that, Jesus said, not just he knew about God, he's saying, I know God, I am him. And they understood at the end, when he finished the Sermon on the Mount, they understood he is unique in a sense that we've never heard a teacher like this before. All right, so that's the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. So take some time this week, if you will. Read Matthew 5, 3 through 12. That's the Beatitudes. Think about the meaning of those. What does it mean? Define those terms, poor in spirit, all the way down to persecuted for righteousness' sake. And look at the blessings that come from those, and what are they teaching us? Let's do that next week, and I'll look forward to it. But appreciate the study. You're helping me so much to learn more about this, and I hope you're learning as much too. Thank you very much.